Clint Eastwood sat down at the piano, played the first note, and Johnny Carson's eyes filled with tears because that melody brought back a story no one had known for 15 years. It was March 1982. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was broadcasting from Studio 6B in Burbank. It was another Thursday night, a night that promised to be as ordinary as any other in late-night television. Clint Eastwood was the guest, the biggest action star in Hollywood, the man with no name, the tough guy who rarely showed emotion either on screen or off. The interview had gone well, with the easy chemistry Johnny and Clint shared as they exchanged stories about film shoots, laughing at the absurdities of Hollywood. It was the kind of relaxed conversation that made television great. The audience was hooked, laughing at all the right moments. Johnny was glancing through his cue cards, preparing to wrap up the segment and go to a commercial break, when something caught his eye. On the stage, placed near the curtain, was a grand piano. It had been there all night as part of the set decoration, occasionally used by musical guests, but mostly just a background piece. Johnny looked at it, then back at Clint, and a mischievous expression crossed his face. It was the kind of look that meant he was about to do something spontaneous. "Clint," Johnny said, leaning back in his chair with his familiar smile, "I have to ask you something. Do you know how to play the piano?" Clint looked surprised by the question. "I know a little. Why?" "Because," Johnny gestured theatrically toward the piano, "we've got a perfectly good instrument sitting there doing nothing. And I'm curious, can the toughest guy in movies play something soft?" The audience laughed. It was Carson at his best, turning a simple question into a playful challenge. Ed McMahon chuckled beside the desk. Doc Severinsen and the band looked amused. Clint smiled, that rare, genuine smile he almost never showed in his films. "You really want me to play something?" "Come on," Johnny insisted. "Show America that Dirty Harry has a sensitive side." More laughter. Clint looked at the piano, then at Johnny, clearly considering whether this was a good idea. Then he stood up. The audience applauded as Clint walked across the stage toward the piano. He sat down on the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed his hands on the keys. He glanced at Johnny with a small smile. "Any requests?" "Surprise me," Johnny said, still smiling, probably expecting a simple tune, a few chords, something light and playful. Clint's fingers touched the keys, and everything changed. Johnny stopped in the middle of a joke. The entire studio froze. The melody coming from that piano wasn't simple. It wasn't light. It was painfully beautiful. Slow, melancholy, strangely familiar in the way old songs can feel, like something half remembered from childhood. Clint played with genuine skill. His fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision, his eyes closed, his whole body relaxed in the music. This wasn't a movie star performing a party trick. This was a real musician playing something that clearly meant a great deal to him. Johnny's smile faded. His hands, which had been holding his cue cards, slowly lowered to the desk. His expression shifted from amusement to fascination, and then to something deeper, something the audience couldn't quite identify, but could feel. Ed McMahon noticed it too. He leaned slightly toward Johnny, concerned. "Johnny?" he said quietly. Johnny didn't respond. He was staring at Clint, at the hands creating that unexpected beauty, and his eyes were filling with tears. The control room fell silent. Director Bobby Quinn leaned toward his monitors. "He's crying," he whispered to Fred de Cordoba. Fred nodded slowly. "Keep the cameras on him. Something's happening." The audience had stopped their polite applause. They were completely silent, sensing that this moment had turned into something unplanned, something real. Some were watching Clint play. Most were watching Johnny's face, seeing the tears form and begin to slide down his cheeks. To understand what was happening, you have to understand what happened in 1967. Johnny Carson had not always been the unshakable king of late-night television. In 1967, 5 years after beginning to host The Tonight Show, he was successful, but struggling personally. His second marriage was falling apart. His relationship with his children was strained. The pressure of doing the show 5 nights a week, always being on, always being America's comedian while dealing with private pain, was crushing him. He had quietly begun seeing a therapist in secret. In 1967, successful men didn't talk about mental health. They didn't admit they were struggling. They didn't show weakness. The therapist's name was Dr. Margaret Brennan. She was in her 60s. She was brilliant, kind, and had an unusual method for helping patients reach difficult emotions. She used music. "You joke to survive," she told Johnny during one session. "You've built this armor of humor, and it's necessary. It's how you do your job. But you need a place where you can take that armor off, where you can feel what you're really feeling." She had a piano in her office, an old upright piano. She asked Johnny to sit beside her while she played. "I'm going to play something," she said, "and I want you to just listen. Don't joke, don't deflect, just stay with whatever comes up." She played a melody, the same melody Clint Eastwood was playing on the Tonight Show stage 15 years later. Johnny sat in that therapist's office and, for the first time in years, he cried. Really cried. Not the performative emotion he could summon for a comedy sketch. Real pain for his failing marriage, for his distant children, for the loneliness of being Johnny Carson. "This is your song now," Dr. Brennan told him after he had composed himself. "Whenever you need to remember that it's okay to feel, to be sad, to be human, remember this melody. It's permission to stop performing." Johnny saw Dr. Brennan for 3 years. She helped him through his divorce, helped him reconnect with his children, helped him understand that he could be both Johnny Carson, the performer, and John William Carson, the human being. She died in 1975, a sudden, unexpected heart attack. Johnny received the news while preparing for the show. That night he did the monologue anyway. He made America laugh for 90 minutes and never mentioned that he had lost someone who had saved his life. He had not heard that melody again since his last session in 1970. He never asked what it was called. He never tried to find it. It belonged to her, a gift she had given him, and he kept it with all the other private things he never spoke about in public. Until tonight. March 1982, when Clint Eastwood sat down at the piano and, without knowing it, played Dr. Brennan's song. Clint was still playing. The melody continued. Every note was perfect, every phrase building on the one before it. Clint Eastwood had no idea what was happening at Johnny Carson's desk. He was lost in the music and in the memories or emotions it stirred within him. Johnny wiped his eyes quickly, but the tears kept coming. The cameras stayed on him. Close-ups showed the calmest man in American television, completely undone by something as simple as a piano melody. Ed McMahon leaned closer and gently touched Johnny's arm. "Are you all right, my friend?" Johnny nodded, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. When Clint played the final note, letting it linger and fade into the silence, the studio remained still. No one applauded. No one moved. Everyone was watching Johnny. Clint opened his eyes and turned on the piano bench to face him. He saw the tears immediately. His expression shifted from peace to concern. "Johnny, did I do something wrong?" Backstage, the production crew held their breath. No one knew what to do. Live television was unpredictable, but this had never happened before. Director Bobby Quinn motioned desperately to the camera operators to hold the shot. And then Johnny made a decision no producer would ever have allowed. Johnny stood up. He didn't say anything to Ed. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't acknowledge the audience or the control room that was frantically trying to figure out what to do. He simply walked across the stage toward the piano where Clint was still sitting. The cameras followed him. The audience held its breath. Johnny stopped beside the piano, looking at the keys, at Clint's hands still resting on them. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "What song was that?" "It doesn't have a name. Clint said softly. It's something my piano teacher composed when I was a kid. She used to play it at the end of every lesson. She said it was for remembering, for those moments when you needed to stop and feel something real. Johnny caught his breath.
Your piano teacher?
Yes, Mrs. Brennan, Margaret Brennan. She taught me from the time I was 8 until I was 16. She passed away a few years ago. When you asked me to play, I don't know why, but that melody came to mind. I hadn't played it in years. The studio was completely silent. Even the control room had stopped talking. Johnny looked at Clint. Margaret Brennan taught you piano in Oakland? Yes, she was incredible. She taught music to kids in the neighborhood who couldn't afford lessons. She changed my life. Clint paused. Did you know her? And then came the moment no one in the studio, or at home, saw coming. Johnny sat down on the piano bench beside Clint. Right there on live television, Johnny Carson sat beside Clint Eastwood at the piano and began to cry uncontrollably. She was my therapist, Johnny said, his voice breaking. From 1967 to 1970, she played that song for me in her office when I was falling apart. She told me it was permission to be human, permission to stop performing and just feel. Clint's eyes widened in surprise. Margaret was your therapist? She saved my life, Johnny said simply, and I never got the chance to thank her properly. When she died, I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't explain to anyone what she meant to me because I never told anyone I was in therapy. And now here you are, sitting here playing her song. He stopped, overwhelmed with emotion. Clint placed his hand gently on Johnny's shoulder. Two of the most famous and private men in Hollywood sat together at a piano on live television, connected by a woman who had shaped their lives decades apart. She used to talk about you sometimes, Clint said quietly. She never said your name, but she told me about a student who made people laugh. She said making people laugh was the hardest job in the world because you had to feel everything but only show joy. She was very proud of that student. Johnny covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. The camera stayed on them, capturing that impossible moment of vulnerability and connection. Ed McMahon stood from his chair and walked over. He placed his hand on Johnny's back without saying a word, simply being there. Doc Severinsen stepped down from the bandstand and joined them. The entire studio seemed to gather around that piano, not physically, but emotionally. Everyone witnessing something sacred. After a long moment, Johnny lowered his hands, looked at the piano keys, and then at Clint. Will you teach me to play it? The whole song? Clint asked. So I can play it myself. Right now? Right now. And right there on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, in front of 300 people in the audience and millions watching at home, Clint Eastwood taught Johnny Carson how to play Margaret Brennan's song. It took 20 minutes. The show ran long. They skipped commercial breaks. The control room finally gave up trying to get them back on schedule. Clint played a phrase, then guided Johnny's fingers to the correct keys. Johnny stumbled, made mistakes, tried again, like a child learning the piano for the first time. The audience watched in reverent silence. Some were crying. Most were simply absorbed in the intimacy of the moment, watching two legends become completely human. When Johnny finally played the entire melody, imperfectly, slowly, but completely, the reaction in the studio was not the typical Tonight Show applause. It was something deeper, cathartic, the kind of applause that honors courage. Johnny and Clint stood and embraced, a long, genuine hug between two men who had found an unexpected connection through a melody and a woman who had shaped their lives. Thank you, Johnny whispered, for giving it back to me. She would be proud of you, Clint whispered. She always was. The audience rose together in a standing ovation, not for entertainment, but for having witnessed something real. Johnny turned to the camera, wiping his eyes. We'll be right back, he said, and for once, his voice wasn't steady. It was simply human. After the show, Johnny had the piano moved into his office. He practiced Margaret Brennan's melody every day for the next 10 years, until he retired. He never mastered it. But that wasn't the point. Years later, when Clint Eastwood directed his first film about music, he dedicated it to Mrs. Brennan. Johnny sent him a handwritten note that simply read, "She's still teaching us." The melody was never forbidden again. It had become permission to feel.